Thanks, everyone, for joining us again at the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to be joined by Giulia Messmer, who's a spokesperson with Sea-Watch, also works on the media team, and has been involved in anti-racist and anti-fascist struggles since 2015. Giulia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I want to start with some language, actually, because I find language fascinating in terms of how we think about things. And I remember reading, one of the first things I read over at Sea-Watch was something that talked about Europe's reception crisis. And I thought the framing of that was really interesting versus immigration crisis or, illegal immigration crisis or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about why you frame it as a reception crisis?
Of course. So, I mean, for us, the situation at the European external borders, meaning also in the Central Mediterranean, is definitely politically created, is nothing that occurs naturally or that just comes up or is a coincidence, but is definitely out of a political will not to change anything or to prevent people from coming to the European Union and to claim their natural and human rights. To claim asylum. So this is why we phrase it as a crisis of reception, a crisis of the European border regime, and not as so-called refugee crisis, because it's just factually not.
Right. And I'm curious, because it's a reception crisis, Sea-Watch works to save people in the Mediterranean, but what happens after you rescue them? I mean, Europe is increasingly hostile to people coming into Europe. So where do you take them?
So Sea-Watch is a sea rescue organization. I don't know if everybody knows about what we're doing. So we have 2 ships currently operative and also 2 airplanes. So what we do is actively trying to rescue people from distress at sea, but also trying to fly over the Central Mediterranean and observe and monitor human rights violations, as well as find cases of distress, and then, of course, communicate to the competent authorities and any ship in vicinity. So when we rescue people out of distress, we, of course, go and we want to go to the nearest port of safety, which means that state authorities have to allocate the nearest port and the nearest suitable port of safety for ships that just rescued people in distress at sea. The situation at the moment is that Italy really tries to harshly criminalize and hinder civil sea rescue and therefore also migration. So what Italy is doing at the moment is allocating ports that are hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away often, or hours, also for little or more like smaller ships that rescue people. So for example, we have a ships called Aurora, and it's like 14.5 meter long, so really not that big. And when we rescue people, sometimes 50, sometimes 60, sometimes 70 people, it means that we need to find a port and we need to go to a port as soon as possible, because the situation on the ship is often very, like, people are sitting super close together. There's not much space. There's not much space to be, to sleep, to live and to survive. So we, of course, try to be as fast as possible, but with these political games, it's often really hard to be as fast as we usually could be. Going to Lampedusa, for example, which would for us and our area of operation be the closest port. And when then people can disembark safely, they are taken to camps in Italy, to reception centers, and then also redistributed over the whole country. We as Sea-Watch, we don't follow then we don't work on or in reception centers itself. So we don't have usually insights on where people go in the end, where they are allocated and where they are distributed to. So we really concentrate on rescuing people at sea only.
Of course. I mean, that's plenty to do, but the Mediterranean is not exactly a small area. And I'd like to get into a specific story that, I mean, to be perfectly honest, a lot of these stories don't reach us in the United States, but this one did. Back in June, more than 600 refugees died when their boat capsized several hours after sending out distress signals, which once received by Greek officials led to what many have called the murder of these people by Greek officials who left them to die, after also attempting to tow the boat, which then caused it to capsize. Now, of course, this is just one story of hundreds like it. And on the Sea-Watch site, you point out that more than 27,000 people have died in the Mediterranean since 2013, which is staggering. And on your report of this incident, there's an image which reads, "The Mediterranean isn't just a graveyard, it's a crime scene." And so I'm curious, when these distress signals are sent out, when there's evidence of a boat needing help, is there any official European rescue support? And what kind of what happens, for instance, if the Coast Guard of Italy or Greece, what do they do when they see that this is happening? I mean, is there any kind of collaboration that you get from these official European entities?
So when there's a distress case at sea, and when there's like distress signal, either because like our airplane, for example, found a distress case, then communication needs to go to state authorities, of course, because they have the duty to coordinate any kind of rescue. So sea rescue at the European external borders is a state duty. So these state authorities, they are called like rescue coordination centers, and every state with access to the sea needs to have one. They like in Europe, and they are really like obliged to then coordinate. That means communicating to ships that are in vicinity of the case, and then see how these people in distress can be rescued as fast as possible. But of course, over the Mediterranean, there's not only our airplane that operates, but also, for example, Frontex airplanes. So Frontex is the so-called Coast Guard and Border Protection Agency of the European Union, and they also monitor the Central Mediterranean Sea, for example. So normally when they fly over the Mediterranean with drones, for example, they operate, or with airplanes, then they are also obliged to send communications to all boats in vicinity of a distress case, but also to state authorities. But what we witness is that often this communication is not handled correctly, is intentionally not done, and this is why we definitely see a complicity, or we what's the word, like we sorry, forgot the English word for it. Like we point to a complicity of state actors, but also Frontex for distress cases, for drownings. And this is why we're speaking of crimes against humanity, even so far in the Mediterranean, but also state crimes in total. And this is why people are not only drowning by coincidence, but they are let in, like, we European states are letting people drown on purpose in the Mediterranean. And this is, of course, not a single case at the European external borders, but if we also look to the eastern borders in the European Union, there's also a lot of violence going on, pushbacks, pullbacks, to hinder people coming into the European Union. So this is really no coincidence. And I mean, in the United States, there's also huge discussions now about the border with Mexico, for example, where we see the same thing. And this is why we always have to like compare as well and see how states are dealing with borders and how border regimes are actually set up to protect nations, states, and not people.
Absolutely. And I want to get into that in a moment, but I first want to highlight, because you mentioned these crimes against humanity, and clearly these nation states are not facing any kind of legal repercussions for perpetuating these crimes against humanity, yet folks at Sea-Watch and other rescue coordinators have faced charges. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, when talking about criminalization, we of course have to point out the huge difference in resources of states trying to criminalize search and rescue actors, trying to criminalize activists that help people on the move to arrive safely, and then on the other side, having NGOs that are financed by donations of civil society, mostly only, and that of course don't have the resources to counteract states and crimes against humanity. So Sea-Watch and a organization based in Berlin, this ECCHR, we try to actually go in front of the International Criminal Court to point to exactly that, to point to that human rights violations are happening on a large scale basis in the Central Mediterranean Sea, and that these constitute crimes against humanity, and that states need to be taken accountable. So on the other side, talking about criminalization against NGOs, search and rescue actors, activists, of course, the situation in Greece is like horrendous when it comes to criminalization, but also Italy tries to persecute individual people. But this is, of course, also a mean to criminalize migration in the end. So we are one step in between criminalizing migration, criminalizing people on the move. And this can also be observed by law and changes in legislation that have been done after huge shipwrecks caused by states. But then what it has led to, for example, in Italy, there was a shipwreck in February, I believe, the so-called Cutro shipwreck. And after this Cutro shipwreck, the sentences for boat or so-called boat drivers were leveled up. So boat drivers are people that are themselves on boats in distress that steer the boats, and often they are forced or don't have any other economical financial mean to come to the European Union, and then are criminalized on the basis that they steered the boat to flee and to claim their actual right to claim asylum. And what we see is now a huge wave of increase and in sentences against boat drivers. It even comes that far that several months ago, a father was charged for the murder of his son because his son died in the Mediterranean while crossing. So when we talk about criminalization, we really have to talk about criminalization of people on the move because it doesn't receive attention, also because of course racial discrimination and racial bias.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with that, drawing connections here, of course, right around the same time that the boat capsized in June, the Council of the European Union agreed on reform of the Common European Asylum System, CEAS, which further restricted access to asylum in Europe. And here in the United States, many people, including children, in the recent months have died trying to cross the Rio Grande, more than usual. That's the river between Mexico and the United States. Because the governor of Texas has installed literal floating barbed wire, which essentially acts as floating death traps for those trying to cross. And border agents have also been ordered to not rescue people if they see them drowning or struggling, even with regards to children. So basically, like, what similarities do you see in the fights based on what you're experiencing in Europe and what you see happening here in the United States as well?
I meat without repeating myself too much, but like I really believe it's about so-called border protection in terms of protecting state territory, and nation states in the end. And this is not only to be seen now in Europe and in the US, but also when looking at Australia, for example, then we see a state that actively puts people in prison camps, not even on their own territory, but on a separate island, not even in their own state, to hinder, to criminalize, to really put people in even another space, another location, to not having to deal with them, but also to basically violently halt migration in the end. And this happening around the world also just like points to an understanding of migration not as part of humanity as it always was, but as something that we can some kind of stop, that states can stop. And this is also a belief I really don't understand, because people will always find their way. It's a question of how dangerous and how violent are we making safe passage, or like not safe passage, passage for people to find security in the end. And I mean, activists around the globe are calling for safe and legal passages, not only from North Africa to the European Union or to Europe, but also between Mexico and the US. And still, there's so much struggle, there's so much fight, and still it's we're not even close to having it done. Yeah, so I'd say it's like similar in actions when it comes to how states try to criminalize and violently halt migration.
Right. And I'm also curious your perspective on the role of these nation states in perpetuating it. Like in the United States, we being activists, we talk quite a bit about how, well, if you wanted to stop migration, then stop destroying the countries from which they come. People don't migrate because life is great at home. They migrate because they don't have a choice. And the United States, of course, as the world's largest empire, has a huge role in perpetuating the dangerous situations and violent situations that people flee from. What does that look like in Europe in terms of European nation states perpetuating violence from which people flee?
I mean, looking at the history of colonialism now, Europe plays a huge part, the biggest part in colonial history. And this is what we also see today. Now, when talking about colonialism, we can't talk about something that was in the past and it is not happening now. But like neo-colonial structures are still perpetuated by states through economical means, through so-called development help, through contracts and agreements with authoritarian states, like, for example, Tunisia, but also support for the so-called Libyan Coast Guard to stop migration to the European Union. So when looking at the Central Mediterranean, we really also have to look at those agreements at those corporations that are also now, also this year, especially with Tunisia being done. And this not to altruistically some kind of help in quotation marks countries in North Africa, but to really have some kind of self purpose out of it. So when talking about Tunisia, like in the beginning of the year, the president started a hugely racist campaign with a racist speech given by him, and since then, especially people on the move from the sub-Saharan region, especially Black people on the move, are faced with such a wave of violence, of criminalization, of discrimination, of forced disappearances by state authorities, by violence from the civil society. And this is why we also see an increase of a movement from Tunisia to the European Union, not only by people on the move from the sub-Saharan region, but also by Tunisian citizens that can't stay in their country anymore because it just gets too dangerous. So when we then see that, for example, the German government and German police are given trainings to Tunisia, to the Coast Guard, are given technical equipment, then we need to ask ourselves, why is this happening? What is the purpose behind it? Is it really to support people on the move, or is it by coincidence to stop migration to the European Union?
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of what's called the deadly exchange here, which is the exchange of information and tools via the IDF and Israeli forces to police departments here in the United States, including the Border Patrol. So I'm curious, because of your experiences here, what are your thoughts for the future? I mean, I don't see the rise of fascism abating in the United States or in Europe, really. Do you foresee your work becoming more and more difficult and more cracked down on by the judicial systems in Europe?
I mean, we definitely see a huge effort to hinder civil sea rescue in the last couple of years. We see state authorities not communicating anymore on the Mediterranean with civil sea rescue. So, for example, Malta, a state that has been communicating a couple of years before, does not do it with civil search and rescue actors anymore. at all. What Malta actually does is often trying to equip distressed cases with food, with fuel, and with water again. So they make their way on their own to the Italian search and rescue zones. The Italian search and rescue zones in general are the zones and the areas on the Mediterranean Sea that different states are responsible for. So we have a Maltese search and rescue zone where Maltese authorities need to coordinate, are obliged to coordinate by international law. But when Maltese authorities try to hand out resources to boats that then they make it to the Italian search and rescue zone, we clearly see a divergence of responsibility, or a complete ignorance to responsibility, to of course then not having to rescue the people and bring them back to their own country.
Yeah, it seems like if you could give people water and food and fuel, then you could just take care of them in general. But
yeah, and also a distress case is not solved with this. Like a distress case needs to be rescued immediately. It doesn't mean that you hand out fuel and you just let them go until they reach the Italian search and rescue zone, because no one can be sure that they actually make it and people don't actually drown.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally wrapping up here, I'm curious what kind of advice, because it's obviously that it looks different based on geography and situations like that. But what kind of advice would you give to people here who are trying to protect and ensure safe passage for people into the United States from the South?
I mean, firstly, get involved by any kinds of means. Like if you have the capacity at the moment to only share information on social media about the situation at the borders in the US or in Europe or in other countries, do that. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, to anyone that might be even in a slightest decision-making power to change or to spread information. Then, of course, organize. Like we can't solve anything individually, but we have to act together as civil society and find our partners that can actually also influence decision making, no? And don't only organize inside a country, because I really think this is a topic, and yeah, this is a topic that we can't solve nationally, but we have to work together over borders, transnationally, because this is exactly what states are doing as well, and that fascist actors are doing as well. So if we don't cooperate, if we don't get in touch, if we don't build movements transnationally, then I really, really think we lose. But at the same time, take care of yourself, because I really believe if we don't take care of ourselves, especially while working or when working around and in a topic and in a work environment that includes so much violence, it also doesn't serve anyone in the long run. So yeah, also take care of your own capacities.
Very, very well put. Thank you. Giulia, where can folks connect with what Sea-Watch does the best?
You can find us on any socials mostly. So we're on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter /X now, and even on Blue Sky, if you heard of that as well, the alternative to X. And of course our website, which is c-watch.org. And I think if you type in Sea-Watch on Instagram or on TikTok, you'll find us as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the conversation.